7, of course, 27, 28, we are going to discuss how to create and develop application integration components. If you recall, at the beginning of this particular class on Module 4, we started talking about how to create message ports. Let's go and review a little bit. If you want to create a message port, you could create a message port to an organization or to an application. In other words, your message port could send the information to either an organization or an application. So in either case, you would have selected a port. I call it, for example, a port, and then as a name, of course. And then here, you had to choose an organization as a destination, because port would have sent your information into it. So I choose your organization as a destination. And if you remember part of the primary transport, you could have selected application integration component. So as soon as I click browse on the application integration component, you should have seen a list of all available components which have been registered below AIC on the BizTalk. So as you see, by default, Microsoft gives you two different AIC components that are already available. So in this section of the course, I teach you how to create your own components in a way that will be listed in here. So after you chose your AIC component, just for the sake of discussion, let's go and choose one of them. And then by choosing one of these, clicking OK, then later on throughout the advanced property, you could have gone and set the properties for that particular object within the channel itself. So let's go and create a channel from an application, for example. By clicking finish, automatically launches the channel wizard for me. I call my channel a channel. And then here, part of the application, I could have chosen an application that is available or use an Xlang schedule. Just for the demonstration purpose, because I don't care about setting up any specific document setting, I just wanted to get into the property page of my transport. By clicking on Advanced, I can now take a look at the properties of this particular AIC. So now by clicking on the properties in here, I can get exposed to all available properties available for this particular AIC component. So as you see, this is a custom property page that has been created by the designer of this particular AIC. So part of this class also, you will be able to create your own property pages in order to customize your AIC. So you have two tasks to perform. Number one, create the AIC component, and then number two, provide adequate property pages for people who are using your AIC, part of the administration purposes. So you're giving help to administrator in order to go and manage your AIC component. So that's the whole section of this module all about. At the beginning, we are going to discuss different types of AICs. There are two kinds. One is lightweight AIC, the other one is pipeline components. We are going to discuss only and only development on the lightweight AIC in this class thoroughly, and then I have some talk in regard to the pipeline components as well. And we are going to discuss when do you use lightweight, when do you use pipeline AIC components. And then at the end, I just showed you the demonstration how to add your own AIC within the BizTalk messaging. So I have three different demonstrations for you. Let's get started and talk about AICs. As I mentioned earlier, AICs provide custom mechanism for you in order to go and basically do special operations on your BizTalk. The alternative to use the AIC was already a previous chapter, which is chapter 6, or Xlang schedule, or using Microsoft message queuing system in order to invoke a channel execution. But sometimes you want to do even more. You want to do basically an application integration into the BizTalk. You want to bring an existing application that cannot talk to BizTalk and bring it as a component and use it as a transport. Let's say you want to have BizTalk server to communicate with Unix system. You want to communicate with non-Microsoft, let's say, product. You can actually create your own AIC, and within that component, perform all those transportation. So in the next few slides, you learn what are application integration components, and you see AIC in action. And then we learn how to implement AICs in Microsoft.NET. The primary language used in this demonstration is VB.NET, but of course you can switch them easily in C#. But my demonstrations will be only on VB.NET just because of time. So what are application integration components? Application components or integration components are nothing but COM, but the way that we treat this registration is a little different. Since your COM object is going to be shown in certain screens in BizTalk, you have to register your COM object not only with the Windows registry on the computer that has installed BizTalk, but also you have to register your COM below a certain registry keys for application integration component wizards to be able to show your class ID and program ID. So we are going to discuss how to really go through all that. In fact, the BizTalk messaging manager, what it does, picks your AIC component as a mean of transport utility. So you could basically create a custom application and have administrators to use it like they're using HTTP or let's say SMTP and HTTPS. As I mentioned, there are two types of AICs. One type is lightweight AIC, which is using a very simple schema, and basically I'm going to show you how to do that. And the other one is using pipeline component. If you're not familiar with the term pipeline, it actually starts back in a few years ago when Microsoft provided a particular product called Site Server. Site Server 3.0 with addition of a commerce, you had actually pipeline scenario. What is pipeline anyways? Pipeline is very, very similar to the business process in Erlang. You're actually creating different components and you're linking them together. And then could have a script, could have COM objects and so forth. In other words, pipeline is a grandfather of Erlang schedule, really, put it this way. But why pipeline? I mean, why shouldn't we go with Erlang schedule? Well, that's available as well, but you do have the pipeline just in case if you wanted to have integration with old Site Server 3.0 legacies. Let's say you have an e-commerce site that uses Site Server 3.0. You have spent a few $100,000 developing that site, and now you are adding a BizTalk to it. So you could basically create a pipeline and have the pipeline to talk to your BizTalk. The pipeline also is available to successor of Site Server 3.0, which is like Commerce Server 2000 and Commerce Server 2002. If you wanted also to communicate directly with the Commerce Server 2000 and 2002 from BizTalk, you have to also create pipeline components. Pipeline component creation is extremely complicated, and you have to really be a interface and COM programmer in order to be able to do that. However, using the lightweight AICs is a very easy way in order to create application integration component, which we are going to discuss them. Again, if you don't want to use AICs, you don't want to go through that path for maintenance and all, you have two alternatives to AICs. One is using a script components. You could basically write your logic within a script and use it as a script component, or just simply go and design your own COM components and get it over with. It's totally up to you. Or you could just use AIC and have BizTalk to take advantage of it. Now, let's say you made a decision that you wanted to go with AIC development. Let's say you have an application A, that wants to communicate with, let's say, a BizTalk server. In this scenario, application A generates a document A, and that could be in any format. We have already talked about different formats, and we don't want to just repeat those topics anymore. And then you have a channel, and within the channel itself, you're getting the document, you're validating it using a document definition, you perhaps parse it, you might map it, you create a different XML, and then you generate document B. In other words, document A gets converted into document B. So up to that point, there's no brainer really. We have already talked about it for 6 different modules. Now, as you see, the port itself can get the document and send it into a totally different location. However, you can have the port to use a particular transport mechanism called AIC, or Application Integration Component. Within that Application Integration Component, one thing you could do, you could go beyond the utilities that BizTalk supports. Like for example, as soon as you get the document, you want to write a record into a database. You wanted to convert the data into a format of application B. You also wanted to post something to somewhere else. You want to go crazy. You want to do anything you want to do. So you can actually design your own component and use it as a transport mechanism. So that's the whole idea of using AIC. Now, enough of the sales pitch of AIC. Since we know how good it is, let's get it started and take some actions in order to be able to create one. First of all, you have to understand that the BizTalk Server 2002 toolkit is required before you start all that. And then BizTalk Server 2002 automatically provides all available runtime callable wrappers and interrupt assemblies. Just for an info, since you are designing with .NET, you are actually creating a .NET component. .NET components by nature are not interface based. So one thing you have to consider is that you have to use interface based. In other words, you have to expose your .NET component methods to old COM environment. So for that, you need to use interop assembly or interoperability assemblies as well. Also, it uses runtime callable wrappers. In other words, your .NET component has to communicate with COM components of BizTalk. Therefore, they are creating runtime callable wrappers. In other words, they are treating the COM object as a .NET component on behalf of you. So you don't have to be worried about instantiation or garbage collection whatsoever. Runtime callable wrappers are native to Visual Studio.NET. You also have a rich IDE for Visual Studio.NET. It exposes all available methods and properties. You could also develop custom components in XML web services. That's another beauty of it. Within AIC, you actually can expose a web service and have BizTalk server to invoke those web services, or vice versa. You could have a web service to invoke a BizTalk server action. Chapter 8 talks about that, so I don't want to discuss that at the moment. We have a separate chapter only for the web services, so we'll talk when we get there. As soon as the AIC gets created, then you need to register that. So you need to export the .NET assembly as a COM component. So because of that, you need to wrap your .NET component with enough interfaces in order to be able to be shown to the older environment. We call .NET environment as a managed component, and we call the COM component as unmanaged component. However, if you're putting it in a COM plus application, you have kind of a managed environment anyways. We call them managed component as well. Again, COM plus is a grandfather of .NET anyways. So if you think about it, COM plus applications also are kind of managed. So enough of the theory. Let's first learn how to go and work with lightweight AICs, and then at the end I show you how to create it. And also we are going to discuss how to create, let's say, pipeline components. The first thing that you have to understand is the lightweight AICs itself. A lightweight AIC is a COM object that implements one interface, and that would be IBTS app integration. In other words, this interface is provided by Microsoft and has only one method: process message. That's all. You don't want to be very fancy. All you want to do, you just want to process something. So all you need to do, you need to go and implement that particular method and then put your logic within that method. Why? Because BizTalk server internally will call this method name, and whatever is written within that method will be executed. So it's just a placeholder for you. It's just a hook that you have to write your code in it. That's all you need to do. So BizTalk server knows how to communicate with your AIC using this interface. Internally within the BizTalk server services, they are creating an instance of this interface, and they will call that process message. So you need to write your code within this method. So now let's see how do we do it. Implementing a lightweight AIC. First thing you have to do, you have to inherit from service components in the system.enterprise services namespace. And then you implement the IBTS app integration interface in the Microsoft BizTalk BTS components library namespace. My assumption here is that you don't use Microsoft.BizTalk. You only use BTS components library. So keep that in mind. And then you write a process message method. Now let's take a look at an example that is located on page 10. As you see on that example, we are importing system.enterprise services, and in order to do that, first you have to add a reference to the Visual Studio.NET. So let me go ahead and demonstrate that for you. As you see, I've already launched Visual Studio.NET. Since I'm going to generate a AIC, I need to actually go and create a brand new project. I'm using Visual Basic Projects, and I'm using class library. I'm going to create a component, and I call, for example, this Apex AIC. Click OK. The first thing that you have to do, you have to add a reference to a .NET assembly, which is enterprise services. That's pretty important. So the first step here is to add a reference to system.enterprise services. And then you have to import system.enterprise services out of your class. And class, you can name it anything you want. I can, for example, call it, my class name is C, stands for class, my AIC. And then you have to inherit from service components. In other words, what you're doing, you're making a class that is available to COM+ applications. You're making this AIC to be able to communicate with COM+. The second step here is to add a reference to a COM object, which is BizTalk Server Application Integration. And that would be under Microsoft BizTalk Server Application Integration Component. And as you see, I have two different libraries. I have one BizTalk Server Application Integration Component and the other one Application Interface Component. So I'm going to go and choose Application Integration Component, select it, and add a reference to it. That automatically gives me BTS App Integration Library. And all I need to do now also import the BTS application library. So please make a note on your binder for page 10 that you don't say imports Microsoft.BizTalk, because you won't see that. And as you see in this demonstration, if I go with Microsoft, there is no BizTalk, so don't get confused. Now this particular application library has one interface, so I have to use implements, and out of this particular namespace I'm using this particular interface, if you will, and then if I choose the overrides, I actually have to choose the interface. Now as you see, the interface is available, and I have set config data and get config data. Well, basically this is not the interface I'm looking for. I have to look for additional interface, which they call it IBTS application integration. So let's look for that. Let's go ahead and add application interface components in here as well. And let's go and add imports BTS components library, and this, if I say implements, now I can get exposed to IBTS application integration. So there are two different libraries that you can communicate with. One is for customization, one is for interfaces. Now if I go and choose the IBTS application, now I get the process message. That's what I was looking for. So the process message now is available, and I can basically put my custom code in here, which I have a demonstration in which I'm going to show you. So basically, these are the steps that you need to take in order to create your custom application integration component. However, you're not done yet. This particular object needs to be compiled, and there are steps that you need to take in order to register this. And I'm going to take my time explaining it to you throughout the rest of the specific demonstration in here. So as I showed you, after you created your component by number one, inheriting from service component, and then implementing an interface in there, and basically overriding that particular function called process message. Now it's time to register your AIC. First of all, in order to register the AIC, you have to be familiar with the registry keys. Let me go ahead and launch a registry editor. I call regedit, and as you see, part of this utility, you get exposed to all available keys in there. There are a variety of different keys available, depends on the operating system you're working with, but the key that you're interested in order to work with is HKey classes root. The HKey classes root has a listing for all available extensions that have been registered on your machine, and as well it has information regarding the classes and libraries that have already registered themselves. You get also a list to all available IDs and class IDs. If I go up a little bit, you realize that there are some entries for all available GUIDs installed on this machine. As you see, these are all the program IDs, the class, the library name, the class name, and the version, as well as the class ID. As you see, if I open up any of these classes, they all have a class ID. And all these class IDs are registered below another key called class ID. So one of the things you have to understand about your component is there are two different categories that you need to register your class IDs with. As you see, they are listed on page 11. By the time you're registering your AIC, first you have to designate your component as a BizTalk component. That means you're not just going to go and install your class and register it below the root of HK class's root. You're actually placing it under BizTalk component. And you have to actually search for a particular key, and that has been listed for you on page 11. Let's go ahead and find that key. You could either search by the specific category or search by category ID. Now this GUID right down in here belongs to category ID BizTalk component. In other words, I'm searching for that in a minute, and then you see register editor finds that class ID, and all I need to do, make sure that by the time I'm registering my AIC, I'm registering it below that key as well. The reason we want to make sure that we register it under a certain key is that BizTalk server can detect your component as a BizTalk component and can instantiate it. Also, you need to register it for BizTalk AIC, so the AIC screen can pick up your component name as a BizTalk component AIC. So meanwhile I'm searching for that within the registry, remember that you need to designate the BizTalk component and also designate the component as an AIC. And register the component affinity and say how many instances of it do you want to make. As you see on page 12, the way you do it, either manually you go to the registry editor, as I mentioned, you go to the regedit and add the following keys to the registry. So as you see on the HK classes root, class ID, AIC, class ID, implemented categories, and also under HK classes root, class ID, AIC, class ID, implemented categories, add those two GUIDs. Those two GUIDs are fixed. That means Microsoft has assigned those GUIDs. You can't just put any number. You have to make sure you are using those two numbers. As an alternative to register is not really required. You can create and execute a .reg file. In order to create a .reg file, all you need to do, go to a notepad and start off with the midsection of page 12. As you see, it calls regedit4, and then within the bracket you put HK classes root, class ID, and then put the 516 whatever it is as your specific component, and then under implemented categories you put a global ID. Remember that the 516C72E5, that GUID that it repeats itself again, that is the GUID for your component. That means you need to have a component for your, the GUID for your component. And how do we do that? We're going to go back to the Visual Studio.net, and in order to add a GUID, you need to add an attribute. And as you see, that attribute is not addable. You need to also the reference to interrupt services. So under system dot runtime interrupt services, as you see, I have import on the system dot runtime dot interrupt services. If I import that, then I get exposed to GUID, and then I can actually pass a string GUID to it right before my class. Now here, part of this particular GUID operation, I need to actually go and generate a GUID from my tools menu by selecting create GUID, and then select registry format, new GUID. It automatically generates that, copy it and exit this. I copied it within my clipboard, and now I can test it. So as you see now, I pass a GUID as an attribute to my GUID attribute, and now I am asking this class to be identified within this GUID. Despite the fact I'm developing in .NET, but I'm associating a GUID to it, so BizTalk can distinguish this class from others. So for some reason I didn't find that key within my registry. Perhaps I made a mistake writing it. So now let's switch back in here. So that is the way that you're adding a GUID into your basically class object. Now let's continue. So within the .reg, you have to make sure that right after the class ID, that GUID has to be identified. So by the time you're registering your AIC, you're basically letting the registrar know what is your ID, and also you have to specify implemented categories. You could also build your assembly and make sure that you're associating a strong name with it. in order to associate a strong name, first you have to have a key. And in order to generate the key, you have to go to a particular utility and generate that key accordingly. Using Visual Studio.NET, there's a utility called Visual Studio.NET Command Prompt. And there is a utility called SN, or a strong name generator. And as a matter of fact, there are a variety of different properties that you can pass into it. One of the properties that you can pass is /k, and then associate a specific file format to it. So if I go and say -k and call it, for example, apex.snk, which is a strong name key, it automatically generates a key for me. So this key got generated and it automatically creates a key pair written. So if I go to directory listing, as you see, it generated that apex.snk file for me. As a matter of fact, it associates a nice locking icon in there, and then you can see that that's the strong name key. So if I go down a little bit, you see that apex.snk key got generated. So in order to generate a component that uses the strong name, you have to now go to the assembly info and also import system.enterprise services, and not only specify the version number. For example, in this scenario I go with version 1, but also you need to go and specify an assembly for a key file in order to make it to be uniquely identified. So on the assembly key file, you need to pass the string path to your key. So in this scenario, I called it c:\apex.snk to make the job a lot easier. So by compiling my component now, by building it, I'm actually making a strong name key of this assembly. So as you see, that information is listed on page 12, sn/k, the name of your key, and then within the .NET assembly info, you need to actually pass the assembly key file. I've just demonstrated that for you. So let's go and build my project in here. So remember that right now, I don't have any message whatsoever. I can actually just put a message box in there. I just said, for example, hello from my AIC. You could do many things. You could write something into the database. You could do whatever. And then if I build my solution, make sure there is no problem with it. So let's try this again, and this time let's go get it from a specific location, not necessarily from the original BizTalk component. We have installed already BizTalk toolkits for .NET, and if you go under BizTalk server, go under .NET toolkit, I have application integration, and as you see here, we have BizTalk components library. If I try to refer to that particular object now, let's switch back here to the process employee here for a second. Actually, within my own application. Now, since I'm adding that .NET toolkit, now I have to bring Microsoft namespace.biztalk that particular component. So just make a note of it again from your book on page 10, 11, 12, and 13. Make sure that now you're adding Microsoft.biztalk because I'm using actually a specific namespace. So now the implementation works fine, and I can go ahead and compile my application. So as you see, there's no more failure, just because the BTS component, which I've referred originally from the .com, was not available for .NET. So the way that Microsoft has gone and created a new DLL, they actually have created a DLL that is ready for .NET, and they have actually gone and compiled that particular runtime callable wrapper with a strong name key, so we can actually take advantage of it. So since now I have successfully compiled my AIC, I can basically go and register that with global assembly cache. There is another utility called gakutil, and as you see, there are a variety of different parameters available for the gakutil. One of them is -i, which basically goes and installs a global assembly cache. In other words, it adds your particular, let's say, DLL, where we have installed it. So under this particular directory, bin directory of my project, I can now say go ahead and install this particular component on the global assembly cache. And it will add that DLL into the global assembly cache. And now the last thing I have to do, I have to actually add and create a brand new application to the COM+ services. So the COM+ services in here needs to add my components. So one of the available applications that they can add is basically programmatically using the reg services. So if I switch back in here and type in reg SVC, SVCS or reg services, I can actually put the application name in there. And the application name, for example, I call it Apex AIC. And basically that also needs to get the path to that DLL. In other words, I'm adding this component to this application. But prior to that, you need to have this application already installed. So let's go down in here and create a new application, empty application, and then call it Apex AIC. For demonstration purposes, I go and map this with an administrator account. And as you see, the application is available in here now. Now, check this out. The component at the moment is empty. So by the time I run this particular line of code, I automatically add this particular DLL to this application. So as you see, it's trying to communicate with the COM+ application, find this application, and basically goes and registers my DLL with that particular COM+ application. So as you see, now it says the application Apex AIC has this type library and has already installed. So now if I refresh this, you get the application AIC.CMyAIC automatically registered. So you could do anything you want to do graphically, programmatically within .NET nowadays. Again, you have to take course 2557 in order to really understand all these things. I just wanted to show you what do they mean by these pages on page 12 and 13. So basically, you could configure .NET AIC assemblies, but you needed to also register your specific component using either .reg or using the basically registry editor. So I've already shown you how to go through all these steps. Now let's go back and take a look at the COM+ application. As I mentioned earlier, your COM+ application can associate itself with the security. You could add the AIC to a COM+ application, and then AIC will make a use of COM+ security. As we discussed before, you could add roles, like one for administrators and for example, users, regular users, and then associate users directly right off your basically domain or local computer account and add those information to it. Like for example, I'm adding administrator into the admins, and then add regular users under users role, like everyone. So as you see, only administrators are a member of admin role and everybody else is a member of users. Now, by the time you wanted to associate security for your component, you could come down in here on the security and enforce component level security by selecting who can use your AIC. So if I have logged on from my machine and then I try to use your AIC based on the security, you might reject it or you might accept it without writing even one line of code for the security. That's the fantastic feature of COM+ application that I wanted to demonstrate here, part of this particular section of the course. So I've already demonstrated how to go and work with all these elements. So I showed you how to implement and work with an AIC. Now why don't I go and basically use one that Microsoft has already prepared for us. I'm closing the solution, and now I'd like to go ahead and open up a solution that is available part of the demo. So let's go back and bring it over from the demo section under MSD and train. Under 2728 demo codes under module 7, I have basically the solution file in here under my lightweight AIC. And as you see, what Microsoft has to offer you is basically the same class. They have named their class to be process employees. And here, they have pretty much done the same thing that I already demonstrated. They have imported to BTS components library, obviously. And also, part of their assembly, they have basically mapped their key into a particular key. Like I've already generated the key, so I can use that. And not to mention that you have to be careful about this particular namespace in here. That has to come from BizTalk.net toolkit. So let's go and remove this, make sure that we are using a right one. Under COM, if I go and browse, under a particular location on the program files, BizTalk server, and then use .NET toolkit, I can actually go under application integration for VB, for example, choose that particular DLL. And now don't forget that the namespace has changed. Microsoft.biztalk.bts components.library is available. And make sure that you also add that one to the interfaces that are available. And then build the component. And after you build it, you need to go back and add that to the global assembly cache utility. Use the global assembly cache utility and install that particular component in there. So let's go back here to the location in which I have compiled it. And as you see, I have my lightweight AIC. I can actually drag that over and install that part of global assembly cache. That's one of the steps. The other step here is to use the reg services. And using the reg services, I have to actually add that particular component with my COM+ application. The reason I'm not using the application name, just because part of the assembly info, we are using basically the default location in here. So I'm just going to accept the default and register my component with COM+ applications. Automatically they create application under the same DLL for you. So if you don't want to have that, make sure you have a central application and add all your components under that particular AIC. Otherwise you keep creating a new application for each component you're adding. So for the management, you might not want to do that. So keep that in mind. So now if I go back in here and refresh my COM+ applications, as you see, it has created my lightweight application.aic and it added this component into it. So if you don't specify the application name, it will create an application for that particular DLL. Now, the last step here is that I did not show part of my own Apex AIC is to register your particular let's say component with the BizTalk utilities, like BizTalk messaging process. So in order to do that, I need to go and use Notepad and basically create a particular .reg file. And I already have one of this .reg file ready to go for me using the demonstration code. Let's go take a look at it by going through that demo directory again, MSD and train on the program files, lab 7, and here you have code for lightweight AIC.txt. As you see, you can actually go and show all available files. One of the files that you might want to look at is lightweight AIC affinity.reg. If I go ahead and open that up, as you see, Microsoft has already provided this sample code. regedit 4, it will programmatically goes and launches regedit utility in the background and searches for this particular key. And this is place your AIC GUID here. You have to actually replace that with the actual GUID that you have already included in here. So in other words, you have to add this GUID instead of place your GUID over here. That's how you have to do it twice, because you're registering your class ID under those two categories. So you save this and then you go back and you all you need to do, you double click on that .reg file and it tells you, would you like to merge this with the registry? So automatically goes and updates your, let's say, registry. So it says, are you sure you want to do this? I say yes, and by doing that, it says successfully I entered the information into the registry. So basically I'm registering my content below certain keys for the registry in order for BizTalk to distinguish and identify my AIC. So I'm basically done. Now, in order to test it, I can basically go and add a new channel by selecting File, New. Actually, I have to choose a messaging port in order to be able to create a channel from it. So let's go and create a new channel, let's say from an organization or application, who cares, because we wanted to just go and use the AIC, see if I have added my lightweight AIC into it. So I call it a channel. And now here, I can basically say open source. Actually, let's go back and use an application instead. And then here, this time I can actually use an Xlang schedule, and I can actually provide like a document definition for input and output. And basically on the advanced, as you see, it uses the primary transport for send HTTPX. I have to actually use an AIC, so I've forgotten to add that AIC. Let's go back. If I choose an application, let's switch back here to the messaging port, go to my port and edit it. That's the transport address application integration. I like to change that AIC. I like to change this AIC to a brand new AIC in here, and as you see now, it should list my lightweight component as well. So not only I have Apex AIC, but also I have my lightweight AIC. I have added two different AICs in there. So I'm just going to choose my lightweight AIC and then click OK. And of course, I have to include that AIC before I go and create my channel, because the channel allows me to go and basically set the properties. As you see, it says the messaging port could not be saved. It says either the syntax of this address is incorrect of the application integration component, or the component is not registered. So basically, there's a problem with my AIC because I didn't register my AIC, Apex AIC. That's what actually is probably failing on me. But as you see here, you could have seen the list of all available AIC components listed below the BizTalk. So in this demonstration, you saw how to create a lightweight AIC, how to define a class inherited from service component, write a process message method, build the project as a strongly named assembly, install it into global assembly cache, and also add it into a COM+ application, and then associate it with a BizTalk category.